Hello, everybody. It is good to see you. I was distracted for one moment because somebody hung upside down. It's like, oh, it's a little bit challenging, but we're all up right now. I'm glad. So today we are going to talk about actually how to change behaviors, because all the things, all the stuff that we talked about so far, stress and nutrition and exercise and those kinds of things, really are designed to put us in a good state, in a state where we can learn, in a state where we can change. And today we're going to talk about, how can we change behaviors in ourselves? How can we change behaviors in others? How can we, and not only, in human services, not only for, children we work with, but also for people we supervise, people we work with, teamwork. So how do we change behaviors? And, when we're talking about changing behaviors, I just wanted to kind of point out that, changing behaviors should only be a goal if something does not work for somebody. So it's not, we shouldn't decide necessarily, who has to change a behavior. We really have to kind of look at behavior changes or improvements or replacements being really only necessary if something does not work for a person. So that's a huge, big thing. I think historically, there was somebody who sent me in the evaluations last time, there was a question, and somebody, he or she, I'm not sure, asked me if I could talk about how to, tell people who are narcissistic, or how to tell people who have experienced trauma or sexual abuse or physical abuse or loss of life in the military. How could they talk to them so that that person would change? Because their actions are hurtful, there are some boundary issues. So this is kind of what she asked me to do. So one of the things is that is really an incredibly complex undertaking. I think based on kind of old notions of psychotherapy, we think that if we just tell somebody something, or if they just gain an insight, or we just find an approach to talk to somebody, they're going to change behavior. That is not true. Behavior is really a very kind of complex undertaking. The way we approach somebody, the way we talk to people can lead and invite behavior changes. And sometimes things are very simple. So for example, if we have a kid who's acting out and we say to them, stop doing that, sit still, right? That is not a helpful approach to change behavior. Because the moment we do that, we own that behavior. Or if we have somebody who is dysregulated, who comes screaming at us and saying, this is completely ridiculous and you can go to places you don't want to be. If we say to them, that is really inappropriate, and inappropriate is a word that should be just eliminated from our vocabulary because it really doesn't tell us anything. That moment we own that behavior. So we own the behavior, and if we are owning a behavior that somebody else is exhibiting, we are missing our chance for self-awareness to make that other person aware of what's happening, because self-awareness is really kind of the foundation for any kind of changes. And by asking questions such as, what do you hope to gain with this? What do you hope by gaining with this behavior? Or by saying, please explain to me. One of my favorite questions to ask people is, please explain to me why you're doing the things you're doing. How did you arrive here, right? Or if somebody's really dysregulated, we can never talk to a dysregulated person. We have to stabilize them first. So then I will say, I really want to hear what you have to say. So please come back and talk to me the minute you can do that in a way that I can hear you, right? So those are kind of, general kind of talking approaches. But to think that we are able to, just tell somebody to do something and they're going to do it is not true. And unfortunately, this is one of these notions that we not only have in therapy, but that we also have, when we're supervising people. If you just tell them, do this better, do this different, this is not good enough, then they're going to say, okay, I'm going to do that, right? And walk off. If it would be so simple, we would all have a line of people lined up in front of our offices, and they could come in and we tell them what to do, and they would walk out and there'd be different people. So that is not how change works. Change is incredibly complex. So what we talked about so far was just kind of, to really lay down the foundation for learning. When does learning and change of behaviors, what are the circumstances under which that can take place, right? Even if you look at body language, if you want to enable somebody to learn, the way we interact with them on a kind of a body language piece is really huge. So change, if you look at behaviors, the other thing that happens is that people often talk about behavior change, right? But behavior is only a very small kind of component. And many times our efforts, when we are talking about changing our own behavior or behavior of others, are really kind of in the moment. They are not really focused of saying, how can we change things long term? What do we have to do? Because short-term behavior changes are really not helpful to us necessarily, because we really want people long-term to kind of change their behavior. The person who's narcissistic or the person who's hurting other people's feelings, we don't just want them to stop in the moment. It's long-term. And many times we're trying to fix problems, or we're trying to get out of a situation. So if you're a teacher, for example, and you have a kid disrupting the class, it might be really challenging for you to say, you know what, I'm going to invest in the long-term changes for that student. They're going to do some stuff, because what you want to do is you want quiet in the classroom. Otherwise you can't teach. So it's one of the challenges that we're kind of encountering all the time. And so the first thing that, you know, I want to kind of turn the slides on. The first thing, the slide is not going up, so I'm going to tell it to you. So the first thing we're going to look at is, it's from the 6 sources of influence to create change in behaviors and habits, and it's by Al Switzer. And Al Switzer is a gentleman who's really looked a lot at changes, particularly also at kind of, you know, organizational changes, not only personal changes, but a whole kind of slew of changes. And he divides, you know, things into influence and persuasion. It's a hard word for me. Influence is really kind of changes that involve long-term, you know, deeply entrenched behaviors. That getting support with many people and many interlocked behaviors don't happen in a vacuum. They happen with others. They happen in conjunction with our environment. They happen in conjunction with our experiences. So we have to take that context into consideration for long-term change. And challenges also require change in minds, hearts, and actions. So, but persuasion is more of the moment, the moment focus. When I work with my staff, I often say to them, and actually one is on here, and his name is George. He's a wonderful person. And George loves peace. George does not particularly like conflict. He's one of the nicest human beings there is, but conflict is not good for him. So he's trying to appease the situation rather than looking at what are the long-term investments we have to make. And they go, hi, George, sorry, didn't mean to, I'm not going to out you, but, I just figured since you're here, you're good. All right. So what are kind of the long-term mechanisms? How can we change things long-term? And appeasing a situation or fixing it for the moment is very different than long-term change. So, persuasion involves challenges are more short-term. Challenges are typically involve getting someone to say yes or no, or they're, getting a verbal agreement or support. So one of the things that is, still can have a hard time with the clicker. I'm going to move on ahead. One of the things that, we also, that has happened is that we have in human services and in therapeutic kind of environments, we have not focused a lot on habits. So habits was something that was originally, associated with the 50s. It was, I'm going to go back to that one. It was originally associated with the 50s, and it was associated with, of course, Pavlov's dogs, right? The whole kind of salivation experience. And that's kind of the foundation for behaviorism. And, it came back into the forefront kind of in the mid-90s. That's what people looked at at habits, because habits are really huge when it comes to behaviors. And it's always interesting to me that people look at habits and behaviors in a different way. Habits are really operationalized behaviors or behavior changes. So, they're not just isolated, but habits are really how we operate all day long. And if you think about the power of habits, right, and here's the power of habits is, I think, really a great statement here. The chain of habits are too weak to be felt until they are too strong to be broken. That's a huge, big thing. All of us, you can the next slide, all of us are very much entrenched in habits. So habits shape who we are. 40 to 50%, and with most researchers looking at habits at 40 to 43% of all human behavior, the way we think, the way we feel, how we act, falls into the habit category. So if you think about it, 40% 42% of all of our actions are habitual, right? And that's so interesting because if we look at behavior, we always look at behavior as something that's willful, conscious. If you just wanted to, if he just has willpower, he can just change behaviors. But the interesting thing about habits is they're operating unconsciously. So, which also brings us kind of to the whole concept of, the nature of behaviors and the nature of habits. Both, the nature of behaviors and operationalized behaviors, habits, is such that you cannot stop something. You cannot say, stop biting your fingernails, stop being, so rude to me, without thinking, what can we replace the stopping with? Because every behavior, we established that in the first 2 sessions, has a function. Every behavior has a purpose. So simply to say to stop something is never going to work because it will creep up again. There was this wonderful kind of, experiment, that was done with, polar bears or white bears, where a psychologist, I think the name was Wagner, was asking people to talk about their lives and to not mention the word white bear, right? And who talks about white bears on a regular basis? Most of us don't. To make a long story short, the researchers showed that if you asked, people to suppress something, it's coming back into their consciousness at a much higher rate than if you would ask them not to suppress it. And the reason is that there's a mechanism that kicks in that asks us, how are we doing? Are we talking about the white bear? Are we not talking about the white bear, right? And that brings it back to our consciousness. So simply suppressing something, to say stop that, is counterproductive to those 2 things. The other thing is kind of willpower, right? A lot of times people think like if people just have the willpower to do something, and willpower is interesting because willpower is often associated with a kind of strength or weakness, right? But behaviors, are so much more complex than just being tied to willpower. And we're going to talk a lot about that. So willpower is actually not a huge, big contributor to changing behavior. So habits are defined as regular repeated behaviors that requires little or no thought as they are learned rather than innate. Automated behaviors, which we repeat over and over again, becomes in the same environment, which is run by our subconscious. So again, one of the things that is one of the mysteries is, or the misconceptions is that behavior is only internally and it's not connected to our environment. Behavior and habits are hugely connected to our environment. If you go back, for example, to the sensory piece, right, when we talked about how we interact with our environment, how the sensory kind of, stimulation that we need or don't need, can shape, how colors are impacting our moods, movement, all those kinds of things are really, an integral part of behavior and habits. Behavior patterns are learned through context-dependent repetition, and there's a context, which includes the environment. So since I always like to, back things up by science, because I think there's often a tendency to, come up with things, new fads, new approaches to things that are not science-based. I always like to kind of put a piece of science in it. So, this is from the Neuroscience of Habit Formation from 2019. To function, we need the balance between habitual and goal-directed actions. And the reason why we need that is, if you think about, the reason why habits are so ingrained in our brain chemistry and our neuroscience is they save energy. So think about back to, that the brain uses up 20% of the body's energy. So thinking, willpower by the way too, and constantly and consciously thinking about everything we do takes up an enormous amount of energy. So if you would have to get up and in the morning and you have to consciously think about what it is you're doing, how to put on a coffee maker before you consciously have to go into your car and, back out of the driveway, those kinds of things, you would use up all your energy that you need for other tasks that you encounter during the day. The tasks that require decision-making and problem-solving that is conscious, right? So habits are really a vital piece to our survival. And that's also why they are so hard to break, right? And often, like when people think about habits, they think about health habits, exercise. That's most often what's associated. It's actually so much more. The habit, for example, what we do when we feel lonely. So if people, for example, carry a diagnosis of depression, they are much more likely to actually go on Facebook and check their emails in order, of course, to, not feel lonely anymore. So even emotional states, and interaction with environments become habits. So the goal is really to have an efficient brain that frees us up for other things. There are other interesting things, like efficient brains are smaller, and that makes childbirth easier. I mean, those are kind of fascinating facts. I don't know where they stick in my head, but they do. So we basically, before we develop an automated habit, we have to start with goal-directed behavior. So when you, for example, when I got my pickup truck, I have this enormous pickup truck. I went from a little kind of car to a big pickup truck, so I can tow my horse trailer. When I was backing up at first out of my driveway, it took me an enormous amount of energy to make sure that I wasn't hitting anything with my big pickup truck. Now I don't even think about it, right? I get in, and if I'm lucky, I get out all right. Sometimes they're a little bit challenging too. But so those are the kinds of things that we don't even think about, but it starts with a conscious effort. Every habit starts with conscious effort. Then purposeful and goal-directed behavior is associated with the frontal lobe, and is with the orbitofrontal lobe actually, which is located in the prefrontal cortex, and it's responsible for attention, all executive kind of functioning, things. Planning, anticipating. The basal ganglia are a group of structures that are linked to the thalamus and the base of the brain, and its functions includes control of voluntary motor movements, procedural and reinforcement learning, and routine behaviors and habits. During the learning or during the process of goal-associated association, connections between the cortex and the ganglia change their activity, and they're switching to a more automated association. So what that basically looks like is, there was this researcher, her name is Nancy Wood, and she did 30 years of research on behavior, right? On behavior and patterns and habits. And she, put sensors into mice's heads. I think she did that very humane, and I'm sure she used general anesthesia, but she put sensors into, brains of mice. And she basically had a T maze, and the mice were behind kind of a barrier. They clicked. That was kind of the cue. The mice went to find the chocolate. And at first it took the mouse quite a long time. As the mouse knew where the chocolate was, she was faster and faster and faster. And what they've seen in kind of in the brain chemistry of the mouse was that the prefrontal cortex was much less involved as long as this went on, and the ganglia was much higher involved. And eventually it just took over, and there was no more kind of orbitofrontal cortex activity. It was very minimal. So that is kind of the science thing. And the same goes for humans, the same kind of mechanism. The other thing that's interesting, so if you think about like complexity of behavior, right? So we have very simple behaviors and, very simple habits, and we have very powerful and complex habits. And I will tell you a story here because it just kind of fits in. So growing up in Germany, everybody was a smoker. My parents smoked, everybody smoked. Of course, I smoked. I mean, we had smoking rooms in classrooms. Even when I came to the States in my first job at DCF, we had a smoking room, right? So everybody smoked. So I tried to, give up smoking. And at one point, I was able to give up smoking, and it wasn't very pretty. I was able to give up smoking, and because I wanted to get pregnant. And I stopped smoking until, I stopped breastfeeding my second child, and then I became a closet smoker before I gave up smoking for good. And the interesting thing is, so smoking is a very, very hard habit to break. It is actually not an addiction. Because research shows, for example, that the nicotine addiction goes away within almost like a week, about a week, a little bit less than a week. So they did like research where they showed how long can the nicotine stand in there. So, but it's actually a very strong habitual addiction. So, smoking is one of the most powerful habitual kind of habitual challenges when it comes to changing our behavior, because I associated everything with smoking. I got up in the morning, had a cup of coffee, smoked. I was anxious, I smoked. I was happy, I smoked. I was tired, I smoked. Also, the good ADD person I am, smoking is a stimulant. So each time I smoked, I got the reward of being able to focus better. So it's a very, very kind of powerful and complex kind of a, behavior. So we talk about how to change it later, but just to kind of see that there are different kinds of, more simple behaviors and more complex behaviors. More complex behaviors require a lot more repetition in order to get rid of them. So for example, that's why, habits almost actually are never completely extinct. They're overshadowed, but they're almost never completely extinct. So, so what happens is that, if you look at all the different kinds of tasks that are involved with, driving a car, for example, if your brain would have to respond to each of those different components all the time, it would take a lot of effort. So there is a process under which the brain lumps all these different parts together so that they only see this as one task and not as several ones. So over time, tasks become more automatic, and there's a process too where originally there's a checking process with confirming and error cells that kind of diminishes over time. And the result of that is that the brain is less sensitive to outcomes. So what was initially looked at as a reward for behavior, and that has kind of, kept the habit and the behavior from growing, is not going to be as outcome dependent anymore later on. So the man who kind of brought habits back to the forefront of everybody's attention and kind of gave it a whole new kind of life is this gentleman. And he says the difference between who you are and who you want to be is what you do. And that is such an interesting thing, because we have, again, as we kind of said, we have historically neglected habits. I mean, how often do you get up in the morning and say, I'm going to consciously look at my habits, right? What do I do? Am I the person I want to be? Do I want to change something? We don't. And we should, because if habits make out 40 or more than 40% of who we are, then there's such a big part that we should examine them. We should all, take a day and kind of journal down. What are our habits? And at the end, sit down and say, am I really the person I want to be? What are my habits might get in the way of me accomplishing things? And, again, it's so challenging to do that because habits are so automated for us. So Charles has developed this kind of book. He wrote The Power of Habits, is a famous book. And it basically was, based on the idea, or based on the way that habits are formed by a trigger. Something that, causes us to, signals us to do a routine. So my smoking behavior, for example, it was when, I paired it with all different kinds of environmental stuff. If I had a beer, if I had a coffee, as I said before, emotions, times of day, last cigarette before bedtime. So we're going to look at how those triggers are kind of a really important piece in habits. So, a trigger that causes you to do certain things, right? Some people, he uses the example of him going at 3:30 to get a cookie. A routine, the habit in itself. So the routine would be me smoking, you go and eat a cookie, and then the reward. Because a reward is really important. Rewards is what makes things stick in the brain. And there are two kinds of rewards. One is a reward that, we get at the end, and we're going to talk about that a little bit too. Like a reward, for example, for me smoking was, probably the most piece was a stimulant for me. But there's also other pieces. I got a social reward because particularly as, as smoking became more difficult, it's a process called friction by, people being restricted from, common places. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. It was also social reward, kind of the smokers, the rest of the smokers, most people may not have smoked. They kind of bonded, and don't get me wrong, I do not want to promote smoking, but I'm just kind of saying that the rewards can be all different kinds of things. So what really happens here is the same thing that happens is when we work with people, with kids, or with ourselves. We're trying to understand what drives behavior. So it's something that triggers it. It is something, the behavior in itself, and then the reward. And the trigger and the reward, but particularly the reward, helps us understand what is the purpose of the behavior, what drives it. And that is a really important piece because, if we don't know what drives it, we don't know how to change our routine to accomplish, to basically change a behavior, to swap a behavior or routine with something that works better. Because again, it's always a two-way street. And every behavior has a purpose. So for example, if a child has a really hard time sitting still in the classroom, and we say to that child, you need to stop it, again, it's not helpful. He's using his kind of body activation to maybe, combat boredom, or maybe it helps him focus. So again, we kind of have to see what is the dynamic of the behavior so that we can understand it. So the cues, so any kind of cues, when we understand what sets us off, what starts a behavior, right? What sets us off is a time, we do certain things at a certain time, a location, environment, a certain emotional state, which is actually huge, right? When people feel lonely or people have a hard time relaxing, they, as I said, they go on, Facebook, but they also may have a drink or two, or, they may also do something that, might be good or not good. The interesting thing about habits is the brain does not differentiate between good habits, bad habits, and neutral habits. It's all the same. A habit is a habit. There's no selection process in your brain that tells you this is good for you, this is not good for you. They all operate the same way, right? The presence of other people, what do other people do? And the preceding actions. So what do we do immediately before we engage in the behavior, right? And it's interesting because we will see when we look at those things, when we examine our own kind of cues, but also when we look at the cues of people we work with, we identify patterns. So all these things, for example, the cue in positive behavior supports, and for those of you who are teachers, you're probably very familiar with that. So positive behavior supports is something that has kind of replace the old-fashioned behavior modification. And the role of positive behavior supports is to replace things that are not working with things that are better working but have the same direction. As part of that, we're looking at antecedents. And so the cue in habits here is really antecedents in positive behavior supports. What happens right before a behavior, a positive or negative behavior, takes place. And let me just say something. We're looking at behaviors in a two-way street. We don't just want to look at, is a behavior not working, but we also want to look at, is the behavior working and how can we get more of it, right? How can we capitalize on, on what we know about patterns? And, humans are amazing because we all work in patterns, and that goes along with the habits. And then the reward, right? So Charles, looks at the reward as something that's really important. We automatically assume that if you get up at 3:30, we go into the cafeteria and we buy a cookie, that the cookie might be the reward for the behavior. But it can also be a very different reward. It can be a different reward for something. Because the behavior is really going to the cafeteria. It can be it can be the purpose that somebody's bored, they need to get away from their desk. Somebody, the boss is coming around every day at 3:30, they don't want to see him. It could be that they just want to socialize, they want to do something. So the quality of the reward, what we're trying to get out of the behavior, is really important in order to look at how we can change things. So here's, the power of habit, that basically the idea would be that, the idea that Charles had was that if we want to kind of change habits, which is a huge undertaking, it takes a lot of energy, and we're going to talk more about that. But if we're most efficient and we'll be most successful in changing habits if we leave the cues in place, if we leave the rewards in place, or we're rewarding ourselves in a way, because rewards are huge in reinforcement, but we change the behavior itself. And that goes where the replacement behavior comes in. So we leave the cue, we leave the reward, but we keep the behavior itself in place. Now, one of the things is, for those of you who have ever kind of looked at how to change a behavior, even if we know what we take in place, it's not an easy undertaking. Otherwise, by tomorrow morning at 5 o'clock, we all be better people, we're getting up at 5 a.m. and we are going to be ready to go, right? It also goes again to the fact that knowledge does not change behavior. We said that in the first couple of sessions. We know things, but that doesn't mean we do things. So there was a study done where, I don't know, in the early 90s, America rolled out this thing about eat your veggies, right? And they found that, many people did not know that 5 servings of vegetables were good for you. So they engaged in a huge big campaign. And, they went out and they said, eat your vegetables, eat your vegetables. So they did another survey where they found that most people then in a follow-up study in the 2000s did know it was good for them to eat vegetables, but the behavior hasn't changed. People still did not eat more vegetables, right? So that's kind of a fascinating thing if you think about it. You know, so even if we know something, that doesn't mean we can do it. So who I really like is Al Schlitzler, and he does a lot of kind of, you know, not only individualized kind of looking at habits and behaviors, but also organizational, because of course, organizational habits are the sum of individual habits, right, of all people together. So he looks at what it does really take to change behaviors. It takes personal motivation. It takes ability, social motivation, social ability, structural motivation, and structural ability. So, you know, these are basically the pieces that takes for all of us to work together to change behaviors in order to, you know, change behaviors and habits. So I'm going to speed up a little bit. So, you know, basically here's another kind of thing that says, you know, so that goes back to the influencers. So when we work with people and when we want to help them change behaviors or habits in particular, we then have to ask ourselves, do they want to engage in the behavior? Do they have the knowledge, skills, and strength to, you know, to change a behavior? Do they have the ability? And if you look at positive behavior supports, that goes in the same direction. So positive behavior supports has a skill building component. In order for us to be able to change behaviors, maybe we don't have the skill. So for example, if you look at lots of, you know, kids on the spectrum or people with disabilities or high functioning people with autism, and, you know, they want to be more social. And they don't have the ability because they don't know how to really, you know, go ahead and to be more social. So what we do, for example, is we do something that's called social mapping. We teach social skills because there is no kind of intrinsic feeling for people on the spectrum or people with some disabilities or kids with reactive attachment disorders or people with borderline personality disorders. Remember I said they don't know, they cannot read the room. They don't intrinsically know how to behave. So what we do then is, for example, we focus on ability and we teach social skills. And through this process called social mapping. And social mapping, there is no right or wrong. It's like math, right? If you do this, if you are calling people all the time on the cell phone 20 times a day, the person will be annoyed. And that is a consequence which has an impact on you because you will feel sad and isolated. If you call them once or twice, the person will call you back. You feel good about yourself, and so on. So it's a very kind of methodical, it's almost like teaching math. But that's how we teach people the ability, for example, to be social in order to kind of reach a change in behavior and in change. Social motivation. Most change in behaviors takes place only in groups and in connection with other people. It's very hard to do in isolation. So if you look at, for example, Alcoholics Anonymous, they took a lot of these things into consideration in designing really an approach that has all these kinds of, you know, pieces figured out. So social motivation is really, really huge. So the idea that people can change behaviors in a vacuum is really hard. So social abilities, is there somebody to mentor, to coach? Structural motivation, rewards, and rewards are huge, and structural ability. Does the environment enable the right behaviors? And we're going to talk about that a lot more because it's one of my favorite topics. So here's kind of, you know, a chart that gives you an idea when people say something, what it really means as far as their strength or challenges related to the sources that would require, you know, that facilitate change. So for example, I don't like to, I can't, the boss who told me to do this, it's all John's fault, but it gives you an idea just kind of where the areas are that people might benefit from additional support in order to, again, change the behavior and change the routine. So here's Wendy Wood again. She's the rat lady who has done all this research with rats. And she has basically, you know, kind of come up with ideas, and I think very great ideas of how to break bad habits. Because again, habits are so powerful, and many times, you know, we're trying to create good habits, but we also have to kind of address our challenging habits before. And habits are so very reinforcing. And that is why it's so very difficult to kind of, you know, to kind of change them. So redesigning environments and avoid circumstances that triggers during which triggers in which, or cues in which bad habits arise. So that is a huge big thing. We don't realize how important it is to kind of work with the environment. For those of you who were there at the first and second either the first or second that lesson we had, or whatever we want to call it, I talked about a young woman who habitually kind of assaulted her mother. So she assaulted her mother, usually in their apartment, in a very kind of habitual way. We became involved because actually the health insurance asked us to come in and to help, to kind of stop this, because of course psychiatric hospitalizations are very expensive. And, they asked us to come and help. So what we did as an intervention, we did not work with her. We actually changed the apartment around. We changed everything in the apartment. We changed the colors on the wall. We changed her room. We changed the pictures on the wall. And when she came back from the hospital, she did not engage in any more assaultive behavior in that environment. So a change in environment is almost like a clean slate. Or when we have people move, when we have a foster child move into a home, or we have a turning 22 adult moving into a new house, what we do is we very thoughtfully, plan everything from environment to interactions to demands, because we have one chance to get it right. A move-in environment is always a clean slate. It is the best and easiest way to facilitate change, because we are not constantly battling associations that we have with cues and battling associations that we have with routine behaviors and habits. So changing environment. Now you can use it on a big scale, but you can also use it on a smaller scale. So for example, if you feel that you're really stuck, you want to change your environment, you want to go up, you're going to go for a walk. If your office, I think for example, my office, I need to change it because it's been in that office too long. Changing, the colors on your wall in your office, just changing things that, that you associate with certain behaviors. An identity shift, right? If you want to lose weight and you want to change your habits around diet, to place a bowl of fruit in the middle of your house in a very prominent space might promote, might get you to eat a little bit more fruit, but it also makes a statement about you. It's an identity shift, right? It's an identity shift that, you say, hey, I am now a healthy eater. The habit discontinuation is a radical redesign. So that, for example, would be if somebody, again, moves or gets a different job. That is a complete kind of, again, clean slate. Temptation building. We use that a lot also in positive behavior supports, where we combine preferred with non-preferred activities. So for example, if you have a favorite TV show and you have a really hard time exercising, it might be really helpful to you to go to the gym and watch the TV show while you're on the treadmill. So those are the preferred and non-preferred kind of activities together that will trick your brain into resisting, because brains are not saying to you when you start exercising, this is really good for you. They're saying, oh no, we don't know about that, right? But if you do these kinds of things, you can almost jumpstart and trick your brain into saying, this is actually not that bad because I can still watch the show at the same time. Stack habits. So, if you already have the habit of, brushing your teeth every morning, I'm sure you do, or drinking a cup of coffee, and you want to remind yourself to take a medication and you just keep forgetting, to put the medication next to the coffee or the toothbrush is something that's called stack habits. And be aware of stress. So stress is a huge, big habit reinforcer. So the way we learn before, after, and during stressful situations forms habits hugely. It's very ingraining. All right, so she, again, Wendy Wood says, shape up the context. Create and organize your environment that makes it easy for you to do the same task. So one of the things that, she's referring to is here, if we make it easy for us to do tasks, we're much more likely to do them than if we make it difficult. And there are two studies that I found fascinating. One was, they did a study on, would distance to the gym increase or decrease, attendance at the gym? And we're talking to driving to the gym. So people who went in their car, they didn't walk, they didn't bike, they went into their car and they drove to the gym. One was 3.2 miles, the other one was 5 miles. In two controlled groups, they found that the distance of 1.8 miles made it much less likely for people to go to the gym as often as the people who drove 3 miles. And it seems so silly because it's just such a small thing, but it's one of the examples of of how the environment and context has an impact on our habits. One of the reasons that the American anti-smoking campaign was so successful and that I was eventually able to give up smoking was that it made it really difficult for people to smoke. When you went to buy, you wanted to buy a pack of cigarettes, they were glass, right? You had to be asking for it. When you went to the supermarket, they said, "Excuse me, can I have a couple of packs of Marlboro?" And then there was an associate, and everybody would look at you because you were still the smoker. And then you had to go somewhere far away on the corner, somewhere and smoke. And other people would look at you and say, "Yeah, they're the outcast people. They're not healthy. They're smoking." So they made it really difficult to smoke, right? On the other hand, if you make something easy and accessible, if you're hiding the junk food, or the best thing is not to even buy junk food, then it is much more likely that you're going with the easier habit rather than going through the friction of kind of the old behavior. So invest in repetition. Repetition is hugely important. One of the frustrating things about behaviors and habits is that they take such a long time. Because, many times, for example, when we are motivated to do a change, or when we're motivated to, change a habit, we think we're just doing it for like a couple of weeks, and we have that initial motivation, and then it drops off. So actually the biggest need for support and rewarding yourself is kind of after that initial kind of, thing, I'm going to change, after the initial decision. So for example, researchers have found in Germany, there's a study that if people would start exercising, they would reward themselves with a piece of chocolate after exercise. It's a little bit like oxymoron, right? They go to lose weight or be healthy, but they ate chocolate. They're much more likely to stick with it. So rewards were hugely, hugely important. And they were even more important during the kind of medium phase of a new behavior, because that is where people are most likely to drop off. Because initially you're gung-ho. Once you make the decision and you say, I want to change, you have 2 or 3 weeks where you're saying, okay, I'm going to stick with it. But look at all the New Year's resolution people, right? They go to the gym for a few weeks and then they drop off. You can see it. I mean, when I go to the gym, I can see the increase after New Year's, and we all know when they're gone. Every year, we know when people are leaving. But that is the part where rewards become really important. The last third of a changing in behavior, that's when things become automated and less dependent on reward. But that, finding ways to reward yourself. Also, most things fail. Most behavior changes fail because they're too big. We don't break them down in smaller chunks. We have to look at tiny behaviors, small changes. So if we want to have it as our goal to, for somebody to be less narcissistic, it will fail. It is a very big goal. If our goal is to help a person to do something nice to somebody else once or twice a day, that is a realistic kind of goal that we can reinforce. So we really have to kind of think about it's the small victories and it's a consistency that comes with change. But one of the challenges is it takes a long time. And, people always look for quick fixes. Just say something to somebody, give somebody a pill, do something like that. There is no quick fix, just like there's no quick fix to weight loss. So I think the consistency in moving along and really learning and sticking with this is really important. Building structure and facilitate repetition. So we also have to have a plan. If you have, you have to have a plan, for you if you want to change behaviors, or for others that makes you stick with it. And rev up the rewards. Again, rewards are really important, and they are going to be the motivator until the behavior becomes operational. Unexpected rewards cause the brain to release dopamine, stamping the details of the rewarding experience into memory, increasing the likelihood of repeating a behavior. So our brain is hardwired to reward us for things that we're doing, consistently. And the way it's interesting that works is often not with the reward itself, but with the anticipation of the reward. So if you look at the brain activity of kind of happy chemical releases, it often happens in anticipation, not during the time of reward. And that is what makes things stick. So this is, this is another piece of I'm going to skip because we're a little late. So if you have not seen the TED Talk from Nir Eyal, he's a really, really fascinating guy. He's a product designer, and he looked at how the industry uses habits to kind of design products that kind of coincide with our kind of tendency for habits, with our kind of habitual, neuroscientific makeup. And he basically says, how do people do that, right? How people are so the industry goes so much into what they know about habits. So for example, they found that if a Samsung phone starts vibrating, you're much more likely to go on to look at it, right? That's a cue. A vibrating phone, you look at it. How are we designed to kind of, habitually use products, right? And so there's a whole kind of science around this, a fascinating, talk, but they really kind of look at, what are the rewards of all addictive products? Rewards of the tribe come from people, right? So we feel rewarded by other people, and it kind of coincides with, with what the other research says as well. So, products look at, how can they give you the illusion that you're part of a tribe, and how can give you, illusion and feed into your desire to belong. So that comes from Facebook. Make us feel accepted, included. That's where the depression study was done, that people with depression have much higher incidence of going into that. Rewards of the hunt. What will we find that's useful? So why will we compulsively check our email? I don't know about you, but we constantly check our email. Why do we do that? What difference does it make if we use this now or 10 minutes later or half an hour later, but we constantly hang on our devices? I think we have really a significant habitual problems when it comes to electronic devices. And the reason is that we want to know, what do we find? If I open that email, is it something good? Is it something surprising? It's kind of the hunt piece, like, what is, if you find something good, a little bit of unknown. You think about like how the brain works, it creates kind of our curiosity for unknown things. It's the same thing with slot machines, right? Maybe next time I'm going to win. So, and the rewards of self, like gaming, for example, playing video games, right, is giving us a feeling of control, of personal gratification, and of competence. That's why gaming is so, is such a part of, our habitual system that, of course, product designers take advantage of. And it goes, if you look at the market research, whether or not it's Febreze or Starbucks, everybody, McDonald's, if you look at McDonald's really having mainstreamed their appearance, every McDonald's looks the same, not only here, but also many other countries. And if I go to Germany, the Germans' McDonald's look very similar to the American McDonald's. So think about like, the association with habitual stuff. So a lot of marketing stuff is really kind of based on habits. So whether or not it is social services, whether or not it's our personal life, whether or not it's barriers that, our habits are posing, or whether or not that we are not taking advantage enough of, our habitual kind of makeup, that we can increase our productivity, consciously, or that we increase who we want to be consciously. Or whether or not we use it really for assisting people we work with, or who we mentor, or who we teach to change behaviors. Habits are a huge, big part. Thank you so much. Thank you.